Hello and welcome to the Car Care channel. In today's video, I want to share with you how do you maintain your Toyota and Lexus in 2024 so we would have the best results going forward. These are some recommendations that will sometimes not follow the manual that comes with the car, the maintenance guide. Do you go with the normal? Do you go with the severe? But these are recommendations that come from my experience, first as a Toyota Master Diagnostic Technician for a long time with a Toyota dealership, and then I own my own shop that works in Toyota and Lexus. This is the maintenance guide that if you follow, you will not have issues caused by maintenance neglect for your Toyota and Lexus. Without further ado, let's get into the first one. The first and most important maintenance is for your engine. Let's start with the most basic and most important maintenance item for any car: oil changes. We're not going to get too heavy into the debate, but we will make a recommendation here. If you have a non-turbo car or a hybrid, 5,000 miles or 6 months. Not a day more, not a day less, not a mile more, not a mile less. I own this synthetic oil that goes million gazillion miles. Just keep it simple. If you don't drive your 5,000 miles 6 months, change the oil twice a year, and you're never going to have issues from oil. 5,000 miles, not more. And I will say one thing: if you do them earlier, you're not hurting anything, but don't do it later than 5,000 miles. And then now we have turbo engines in Toyota and Lexus cars. With the turbo engines, I will make another recommendation, different actually. 3,000 to 4,000 miles, folks. If you want to see very high miles out of these cars with reliability, 3,000 to 4,000 miles, 3 to 4 months. These turbo engines, they can be made to last long, but you got to be on top of the maintenance. That's the number one thing with these engines. And with that, let's move into spark plugs, because things have changed dramatically lately over the last few years. Most Toyotas, modern ones, 120,000 miles, 10 years on the spark plugs, not an issue at all. However, we have some exceptions now. If you have a 3.5 liter V6 2GR FKS on the Lexus and Toyota side, specifically that engine, not the 2GR FE, the replacement interval of the spark plug is actually 60,000 miles. And we're starting to see some spark plugs over 60,000 miles with some severe wear. Let's put it this way. That's just how these engines are. This is the requirement for them. And then the turbo engines, you have the NX200T, the Tundra, the Sequoia, all the engines with the V35A and the T24A, which you'll find in many, many models. These are 40,000 mile plugs, and it is vital that you actually replace them at the correct interval. Yeah, sure, I have 80,000 miles on my car, never replace the plugs, it runs fine. Does it? That's the biggest question, folks. These are modern cars. The computers can really compensate for a lot of neglect, but it doesn't mean that it's a good idea. So be careful with those. Moving on from that to coolant. Engine coolant. The most important thing you understand about coolant is the intervals in the maintenance guide. They're all over the place. Let's just say that one, but I'll keep it simple. Replace your pink coolant or super long life coolant. This is anything over 2003, 2004. Every 50,000 miles or 5 years. That's a very long interval. You don't see the need for 100 and 150,000 miles. 50,000 miles, you're not going to have issues with the coolant. If you have red coolant, which is anything older than 2003, that one is 30,000 miles or 3 years. Keeping it very simple, replace the coolant. Life is wonderful. Now, moving on from coolant to air filters. Folks, there is no interval for air filters, although newer cars will say 30,000 miles. If it's not dirty at 30,000 miles, don't replace it. That's as simple as that. And if it's dirty at 5,000 miles, replace it. It's as simple as that. This is the as-needed maintenance for the engine. Equally to that is the drive belt. There is no interval for replacement for a drive belt. Some cars will go 600,000 miles without a drive belt replacement. Some of them will get it at 50,000. You gotta inspect it. Does it have cracks? Is it feathering? We have concerns with it. Is it making noise? Usually noise is more than often caused by a tensioner that is not putting enough tension on it, but that one is as needed. And the last one with the engine, which is very important, and a lot of folks asked about it, PCV valve, positive crankcase ventilation valve. It is not this is kind of the gray area of maintenance. if you get over 100,000 miles, just over, like we got to 120 for example, and your original PCV valve is still there, it's not a bad idea to replace it. Now on the turbo cars or on the 2G RFKS where the interval is 60-40, I think it is a little bit on the early side to do it between 40 and 60,000. You can stretch those to the following replacement of spark plugs. So you change the spark plugs to 60 with the 2G RFKS, at 120 change the plugs and the PCV valve. Turbo engines, 40,000 change the plugs, 80,000 change the plugs and the PCV. That's the best way I'm going to put it, but just know that is not always a perfect science on the interval there. That is just a recommendation of time and interval. Let's get into the transmission, which is this one is a very important one. Sealed transmission, life fluid, time fluid, nothing is lifetime, folks. Let's keep it simple. If you own a Toyota or Lexus with no dipstick, that is a sealed transmission. It's actually not sealed, just doesn't have a dipstick. Change the fluid. Your fluid type at that point is WS fluid. Change that fluid every 6 years or 60,000 miles, regardless of what anybody says. Don't flush it, drain and fill, life is good. You could do a flush, but just know flushes are a little bit more intrusive. If this is a higher mile transmission, you might not want to do that. That's not the best idea. Now, if you have an older Toyota that uses T4 fluid or anything older than that, 30,000 miles or 3 years, whichever comes first, change the fluid and we're good. Now, we're going to get a little bit into the hybrid side here. We're going to have a dedicated section to the rest of the maintenance, but hybrid transmissions, the replacement window is 60,000 to 90,000. If we see a fluid replacement between that window, we are good. 6 to 9 years, perfect. We have no issues. Now, one thing I must note, in the very newer cars, there is a new type of transmission fluid for the hybrids. It's called transmission fluid E-Transaxle TE. If you see that or you have that fluid, it's distinguishable with its clear color, it's not red, that replaces it every 60,000 or 6 years. It's not expensive fluid, really good news, but replace that fluid every 60,000 6 years without that replacement window, because that fluid is very thin and you might want to get it refreshed here. The last thing is CVT transmissions that use TC CVT fluid or FE CVT fluid. Those are exactly the same as WS interval wise, 60,000 miles or 6 years, and you won't have issues with these transmission. And lastly, the transmission filter. Folks, you do not have to replace the transmission filter in your Toyota or Lexus as long as we are following a good interval, depending which fluid you use in the interval. We don't have to replace the filter. However, if you felt like you've neglected the maintenance, we are doing the first replacement at 80, 90,000. It's not a terrible idea, but it's still not required. The only time you really want to get in there and replace a filter, if you remove the pan for something else, leak, valve body, something, replace the filter at that point. Or if we have contamination, bad torque converter, some repair that is happening, replace the filter at that point. But otherwise, you don't really have to replace it, because as long as we're refreshing the fluid, we've never seen a clogged transmission filter on a Toyota or Lexus just from regular service. What about four-wheel drive and manual transmission here? Let's talk about those. With your front rear differential and your transfer case, replace the first time when the car is new at 30,000 miles. There's not really a year interval, just 30,000 miles. The year interval doesn't always apply. But the subsequent replacement, as long as we're not towing, or as long as we're not heavy off-roading, 50,000 miles is a good interval. But if you off-road or you tow, keep it at 30 afterwards. Now, as far as the manual transmission, first, one note on that, make sure you're using the correct fluid. Some of the newer manual transmission are using low viscosity fluid. Make sure you are using the correct fluid for your application. But same thing with the manual transmission. First replacement, 30,000. If you're not doing heavy towing, heavy off-road, and really heavy use, you're just daily driver, normal driving, you can go to 50,000 afterwards. But if you are doing towing or heavy off-road, keep it at 30,000. That is not a bad idea on those. Let's talk about a few other fluids that are important. First one is brake fluid. Some Lexus models, and namely the performance models or the models with big brakes, F Sport usually, your interval will be 20 to 30,000. 30,000 is a decent interval. However, for everything else that doesn't have high performance brakes, you need a moisture test. There is no interval, folks. I'll leave a link in the description for a really good strip test that is proving more accurate and kind of more durable than the digital one that we've recommended in the past. You got to test it. If it doesn't have high moisture content, well, we are not doing anything by replacing it, just wasting your money. So brake fluid needs to be tested. Power steering fluid is pretty tricky because there is actually not an interval for it. Right around 50,000 miles, and when we're seeing, typically power steering fluid will start showing signs that replacement is recommended, and those signs are darkened fluid, grit in the fluid. That's usually the sign, but there's not a perfect interval, but somewhere around 50,000 miles is not a bad deal. But if you're doing it at 20, I think it's too early. That's just the general recommendation on that. And the last fluid, which is very, very important that you are aware of, you'll usually find it in Land Cruisers like the one behind me, AHC fluid or hydraulic fluid for the suspension. 60,000 miles, folks. I cannot emphasize how important this one is because I see so many folks have issues with AHC and they will bankrupt you. So replace that fluid every 60,000 miles and we're not going to have issues with that system. Just heads up on the AHC fluid. It's a pretty expensive fluid replacement. Fluid itself is expensive, very labor intensive to do it properly, so be prepared for that one. Let's talk about some hybrid specific maintenance items and even plug-in hybrid specific maintenance items. First one is the inverter coolant. The inverter is a very important, vital component to the hybrid system, and it does have its own separate cooling system. So they just have regular coolant, so same thing as the engine coolant interval, 50,000 miles or 5 years, whichever comes first, replace it. Majority of hybrids will use pink fluid. Only the first generation Prius, some of them used red coolant, that do replace it at 30,003, but most of them are going to be your 50,000, 5 years, and you will never have issues with your cooling system from the inverter. Next thing on the hybrid system is going to be your hybrid battery fans. You have to clean those. I mean, this is the most important maintenance on a hybrid. If you don't have one, install one and start monitoring it. The modern ones will all have a proper paper filter. You need to know where it is. You need to not block it. And most importantly, you need to keep it clean. This one is also as needed, so they need to be inspected annually and go from there. But if you live in dusty area, you have heavy traffic, you need to check it a lot more often. So you have to establish a pattern for this filter. It is vital to the life of the battery. And lastly, on the all-wheel drive models of hybrids, you will have a rear e-transaxle or kind of a MGR hybrid unit in the back, however you want to call it. That, most of them will use WS fluid, so 60 to 90,000 mile, somewhere in that window is a good idea. But the newest ones will start using TE fluid. That you need to replace it at 60,000 miles or 6 years, and you wouldn't have issues with the rear hybrid e-transaxle unit. Let's talk about some maintenance considerations, things that I want you to take as food for thought. Let's put it this way. First one is, ideally, even if you are a DIYer, you'd want to have an annual inspection, folks. And what I mean by an annual inspection, by a professional, or if you are a DIYer, you need to invest in properly lifting the car and really spending time. I cannot tell you how many things you will miss by putting a car on a jack stands and crawl underneath it and you're barely, then when you put it on the lift all the way up, so many things you will not be able to see unless you're standing and spending your time underneath the car. That is very important. And the second thing is, if you're a DIYer, there are so many things I see DIYers miss all the time, vital, important things. You need to, if you're a DIYer, you need to always update your information. And if you're not sure, get it inspected by a professional once a year, not the end of the world. If they tell you that here's the laundry list of things that it needs, don't say yes. Go home, think about it, and research, but at least get it inspected, because this is important. This is how things get missed, and then they snowball into big issues. So that is an important thing. Suspension, part of that very important inspection. Although suspension usually lasts a very long time, any car that has over 100,000 miles, you're going to start to watching for things. Are we having a leaky strut that we're going to need to start saving up to replace? So we wouldn't have to get caught in a bad time or it's started to make noise that we need a replacement, and then we're putting cheapo aftermarket stuff. If we knew ahead of time that we had this coming up, we could have saved up for it and put those beautiful original parts. Speaking of parts and original, fluids, filters, everything, please use original parts. You bought a Toyota because it's reliable. The only thing that makes it reliable is its fluids and parts. Keep things original, especially oil. If you don't have a preferred brand of oil that you have used and had a good experience with, use Toyota oil, bottled oil. It's not the best oil on the planet for other cars, but for Toyotas, it is very good. That's the whole point. Same thing with filters. I don't understand the conversation of filters. Toyota filters, originals, are some of the cheapest filters you can buy among other manufacturers. There is no pride in going with a certain brand. Keep your Toyota reliable, buy the original parts, especially when they are actually the best deal when it comes to filters at least. Now, if you have a preferred brand that you've used for years, never had issues with, go for it. You have the experience. But others who are experimenting, don't experiment with oil and oil filters. If you're not sure, get the original stuff and let's move on with our life. I'm just going to keep it as simple as that. However, I will say one thing. Don't go modifying the original design to make things convenient for you, DIYers out there. I have to say that. Don't go changing the canister filter into an easy one that has a spin-on to make service easier for you. And then this is a plastic housing, I'm going to put a metal one, you go buy an aftermarket. Try to avoid modifying the maintenance systems. Instead, use proper service procedures so we're not over-tightening stuff, we're not breaking stuff. That's just a general recommendation for our beautiful DIY community. Don't modify things, especially when it comes to that oil filter, folks. I've seen so many issues from oil filters. Just don't modify things. Oldies but goodies. If you own an older Toyota, there are certain things that you need to know about. Timing belts, they're a thing of the past now, but we still have a lot of these cars on the road, and here's a general recommendation for that. Anything after 2000, and this is a general number, not exact, but anything over 2000, intervals have increased to 90,000 miles or 9 years. That is your interval for the timing belt. Anything before 2000, 60,000 or 6 years is the general interval for those. Every time you do a timing belt, always do a water pump, always do all the idlers, the tensioner, do cam and crank seal if it's a model that doesn't require removing the VVTi gear. For example, the VVTi 2UZ or the 3UZ, these you have to remove the cam to replace the cam seal, but the others, do the cam and crank seals. They're right there. It wouldn't be a bad idea. Now, other than that, cars that have spark plug wires, if the wires are over 10 years old, and the original wires will have a date on them, if they're over 10 years old, it might not be a bad idea to replace them. And I hope at this point, the last car I remember is definitely over 10 years old that has spark plug wires, so I hope we are on our second replacement. Let's put it this way. And the other thing is, if for really older ones that have distributors and caps and rotors and all this stuff, usually every spark plug wire replacement, replace the rotor and cap. Not necessarily every single time you do spark plugs, because Toyota stuff lasts a really long time. You're not going to change all the wires and plugs and rotor and cap every 30,000 miles just because the plugs need to be replaced. So those reserves them to the 10-year mark. It's really by time more than miles. The last thing I will tell you, and this is something that has come up as a question, valve clearance on engines that don't have hydraulic lifters. This is not a maintenance item, folks, for Toyotas at least. This is a repair item. If we don't have ticking noises when the car is cold that goes away, we don't have a reason to believe that the valve clearance is out. We do not do anything with it. Now, if you're taking the cylinder head out for work, whatever the case may be, check it. If it needs adjustment, adjust it. But otherwise, this is not a maintenance item. I'm just letting you know that. Folks, keep your Toyota a Toyota and make it reliable. Use original parts. That's one important thing I will tell you. If you have your preferred brands that you have experience with, nothing wrong with that. But if you're not sure, take the gray area out of the question. Keep it original and you will not have issues. Folks, I hope this video was helpful and informative. I hope you learned something new. If you like it, consider giving it a thumbs up. If you're not a subscriber, consider subscribing to the channel. Check out some of my other videos. Until the next video, folks, may the Lord bless you and keep you, and you have yourself a wonderful day.